Jake Morrison floated near his small salvage ship in the darkness of space and stared at the strange vessel before him with wide eyes and a racing heart. The ship looked nothing like anything he had ever seen in his 3 years of collecting broken ships and selling their parts for money, and it shimmered with colors that seemed to move and dance across its surface like water. He guided his salvage ship closer and attached the magnetic clamps to the strange hull with a loud clunk that echoed through his cockpit and made him jump a little. Jake put on his helmet and opened the airlock and stepped into the mysterious ship in his flashlight. Beam cut through the darkness inside and revealed walls that glowed with a soft blue light. Then he saw her hanging in the air inside some kind of energy field that crackled and hummed, and his breath caught in his throat at the sight. She looked almost human, but her ears came to gentle points, and her skin held a faint glow like moonlight on water, and her silver hair floated around her face. In the zero-gravity she wore armor made of the same strange material as the ship, and it fit her perfectly and shimmered with that same flowing color pattern. But what made Jake freeze completely was the small creature coiled around her sleeping form like a protective guardian, a dragon, no bigger than a house cat with scales that shifted from red to gold to colors Jake had no names for. And when his light touched it, the dragon opened its eyes. Those eyes locked onto Jake with an intelligence that was unmistakable and almost frightening, and the dragon did not look away or blink. Energy field around the woman began to flicker and fail, and warning lights that Jake could not read started pulsing on panels all around the chamber. Jake whispered to himself that this was way beyond anything he should be dealing with, but the engineer part of his brain was already working and analyzing the damage. He could see burned out power conduits and shattered crystal matrices and a dying power core that would fail completely in maybe a day or two. Jake knew he could fix this ship and bring it back to life, but he wondered if he really should get involved in whatever story this woman and her dragon were part of. The dragon kept watching him with those strange eyes, and Jake thought he saw something in them that looked like hope or maybe a plea for help. He made his decision right there in that moment and started pulling tools from his belt to begin repairs on the mysterious ship. 3 long days passed while Jake worked on repairing the ship and reconnecting power systems and replacing damaged parts with whatever he had on his salvage vessel. The small dragon watched everything he did and made soft chirping and clicking sounds and seemed pleased when Jake got something working correctly. On the 3rd day, when Jake connected the final power relay, the entire ship came alive with a deep humming sound that he could feel in his bones. Lights bloomed across every surface, and the blue glow intensified, and patterns flowed through the walls like thoughts moving through a living brain. The energy field holding the woman dissolved, and she started to fall, but the dragon was there. In a flash of red wings that seemed too small to work, the dragon somehow supported the woman, who was twice its size, and lowered her gently to the floor, and then looked at Jake with what he swore was a nod of thanks. The woman opened her eyes, and they were violet and deep and ancient, and when she looked at Jake, he felt like she could see right through him. She spoke in a language that sounded like music and wind chimes, but the ship itself began translating, and her voice came from the walls around them. "You saved us," she said, in a voice filled with wonder and exhaustion. Jake swallowed hard and explained that her ship was dying, and he was a salvager, and fixing broken things was what he did for a living. She sat up slowly, and the dragon settled onto her shoulder and made a protective trilling sound and watched Jake carefully. The woman touched a pendant at her throat and studied Jake with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "I am Lyra Silverwind, and I am queen of the Starborn Elves and last daughter of the Eternal Fleet," she said, and her voice became softer. "And I am very far from home." Jake introduced himself as a freelance salvager from Providence Station and told her she was in the outer reaches, about 40 light years from any major trade route. Lyra became very pale and asked how long she had been in stasis, and her hand clenched the pendant so hard her knuckles turned white. Jake admitted he did not know, but the ship was really old, and some of the technology was unlike anything he had ever seen from any known alien race. She closed her eyes, and her whole body trembled for a moment, and when she opened them again, Jake saw determination and steel in her violet gaze. "Then my people may already "Be lost," she said quietly, and explained that the Shadow Fleet had been overwhelming her forces when her ship was damaged. She had given the order for her people to scatter across the galaxy and survive, and she thought she would die with her vessel in that final battle, but you prevented that, she said, and stood up on shaky legs, and the dragon chirped in alarm at her wobbling. Jake moved without thinking to steady her, and Lyra gripped his arm, and her skin felt cool and where she touched him. He felt a strange tingling like electricity. "You have given me something precious," she told him, and met his eyes directly, and he saw not a queen, but a warrior who had lost everything. She asked if he would help her find what remained of her people, and help her finish the war that had begun so long ago. Jake thought about his quiet, boring life of salvage work, and scraping by and never taking any real risks or doing anything meaningful. He looked at the dragon watching him with trust in her alien eyes, and at Lyra, whose hand trembled against his arm despite her proud bearing. He said quietly and felt something change inside him as he spoke, "And yeah, I will help you with this." Providence Station hung in space like a giant piece of junk covered in patches and additions, and Jake had called it home for 2 years now. He guided the ship called Star Whisper into the salvager docks and wondered if his quiet, anonymous life there was about to end badly. Lyra stood beside him, and the dragon named Ruby sat on her shoulder and had grown to the size of a small dog in just 1 week. Jake had convinced Lyra to wear a hood to hide her face and keep Ruby in a backpack, but even disguised, she moved with a grace that made people stare. They found Marcus Webb in his usual spot at a bar called the Broken Compass, where criminals and smugglers traded secrets for money. The information broker looked up from his drink, and his mechanical eyes whirred and focused on Jake with obvious interest. "In curiosity, Morrison," he said, "and I heard you pulled something strange out of the black and curious minds are asking questions about you." Jake sat down across from Marcus and asked what kind of minds were asking, and felt his stomach tighten with worry at the dangerous kind. Marcus replied and leaned forward and explained that a military ship with special forces had come through 3 days ago. They were asking about unusual salvage and alien technology and anything that did not match known databases, and they had pictures. His eyes flicked to Lyra under her hood, and he said the pictures were old drawings of people with pointed ears and ships that looked grown instead of built. Lyra reached for her pendant, and Jake felt the temperature in the booth drop several degrees and saw frost forming on the table edge. Marcus pulled out a data chip and explained that he had something else from a salvager working near the Vale Nebulace. Had found a dead ship covered in strange writing, and inside was a star map and a message in an unknown language. Ira pulled back her hood and revealed her face, and Marcus's eyes widened, but he was professional enough to just nod and continue. He activated the chip, and a voice emerged that was ancient and faded and crackling with static, but Lyra gasped, and tears filled her eyes. She listened to the whole message with her hand gripping the table hard enough to crack the cheap plastic surface. When it finished, she sat back and breathed hard and told them it was a beacon left by the scattered fleet with coordinates to a sanctuary world. "We have to go there," she said with desperate hope in her voice. Marcus interrupted and warned them that the hunters had the same chip and got it 2 days earlier and would already be heading there. Jake stood quickly and said they needed to move fast and get to those coordinates before the hunters found the sanctuaries. They left the bar. Ruby stirred in the backpack and made a low growling sound that Jake had never heard from her before. Lyra stopped walking, and her hand went to the dragon, and her eyes scanned the corridor with sudden alarm and fear. "They are here," she whispered, "and I can sense them in the darkness. Has found us from the shadows between support beams." 6 figures emerged wearing black armor that seemed to absorb all light around them. Their weapons hummed with energy that Jake recognized from various wars and conflicts he had heard about on the news feeds. The leader removed his helmet and showed a scarred human face with glowing red mechanical eyes that pulsed with an eerie light. "Queen Lyra Silverwind," he said in a voice made harsh by a throat implant, "and the collective has waited a long time for this moment." He told her she would reveal where her people were hiding and then watch as they finished what the Shadow Fleet had started centuries ago. Ruby exploded from the backpack and grew to the size of a horse in seconds, and her roar shook the metal deck plates under their feet. Lyra's hands blazed with silver light and Jake realized that whatever he had gotten himself into, there was absolutely no turning back now. The war had found them, and the battle was about to begin. Right here on Providence Station, the battle lasted only 17 seconds, but it completely changed how Jake understood the universe and what was possible in a Truby. Fire was not normal flame, but something ancient and terrible that made the air scream as it passed through space. The first hunter armor melted like candle wax, and he managed one short scream before the dragon jaws closed on him with crushing force. The other hunters scattered and returned fire with weapons that carved glowing trenches in the deck and made alarms blare throughout the station. But Lyra moved like water flowing around rocks and like light bending through space in her hands, wove patterns that left silver trails in the air. When she touched the energy bolts, they simply stopped existing, and when she touched the hunters, they fell with their mechanical parts sparking and dying. Jake ran for the ship and fired his salvager pistol to keep one hunter pinned down, while Lyra and Ruby handled the rest with brutal efficiency. They made it back to Star Whisper with alarms screaming across the entire station, and Jake slammed the emergency release, and the clamps disengaged with a shriek. Lyra was already at the organic controls with her hands pressed against panels that responded to her touch. Like they were alive, she warned that the collective would have backup waiting, and they never hunted in small numbers without reinforcements nearby. 3 sleek predatory ships emerged from the nearby asteroid field right on cue, and they had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment. Jake asked if they could fight and win against 3 military-grade ships. Lyra smiled, and it was sharp and cold and dangerous, and she told him to watch what Star Whisper could really do. The ship moved like nothing Jake had ever experienced, and it did not accelerate so much as simply exist in a different place. Reality seemed to bend around them as Lyra wove between enemy fire and the collective ships kept shooting at empty space. Ruby had shrunk back to cat size and perched on the navigation console, with eyes glowing the same silver as Lyra, hands on the controls. The dragon chirped, and somehow Jake understood her saying there was a weak spot on the port vessel in Engine 3. Lyra hands danced across the controls, and Star Whisper weapons that looked like living organic things spat bolts of condensed starlight. Targeted ship engine exploded in a brilliant flash and sent it spinning away, trailing debris and atmosphere into the void. But the other 2 ships adapted quickly and split up and fired in patterns that even Lyra could not completely avoid with all her skill. Something hit Star Whisper rear section, and the ship shuddered hard, and warning lights bloomed across every surface. Like a disease spreading, Lyra called for Jake to get to engineering and override the safety limiters on the jump drive to give them more power for an escape. Jake was already moving and pulling energy from life support and weapons and everything. That was not absolutely essential to jumping. He called out that limiters were off, but warned that if this did not work, they would all die in a very spectacular explosion. It will work, Lyra said, with absolute certainty in her voice, and it must work. Because we have no other choice. The collective ships closed in with weapons glowing and charging for a final devastating salvo that would tear Star Whisper apart completely. Jake saw the bolts launch and knew they were the end, racing toward them. At the speed of light with no chance of dodging, Lyra hands slammed down on the controls, and reality broke apart around them. For one instant that stretched into forever, Jake saw the spaces between stars and the pathways connecting all things in the universe. He saw Lyra. She truly was, which was ancient and powerful and terrified and alone after losing everything she loved. He saw Ruby, who was not a pet but a keeper and one of the last star dragons bound to Lyra by oaths older than humanity, and he saw the darkness and the shadow fleet, vast and patient and waiting in the deep places between galaxies for the elves to reveal themselves. Then they were through and emerged into normal space near a nebula that burned with colors Jake had never seen or imagined possible. Iris slumped in her seat, completely exhausted, and Ruby curled in her lap with scales gone dim and dulled. Jake stood at the engineering console with his hands shaking and finally understanding the weight of what he had taken. On the coordinates from the message, Lyra said softly, and we are here, and the sanctuary world is just beyond that nebula. Jake asked what if it was a trap, and what if the collective got there first and was waiting in ambush. Then we fight, she said. and looked at him with desperate hope in her ancient eyes, and because what else can we do? This is all I have left, she continued, and this one chance to find my people and warn them, and finish the war that stole everything. Jake moved to her side, and placed his hand on her shoulder gently, and told her they would go in ready for anything that waited. Ruby chirped agreement, and her scales brightened slightly with renewed energy and determination outside the view screen. The nebula beckoned and looked beautiful and mysterious and potentially deadly in equal measures, turned toward it, and began the final approach to whatever awaited them on the sanctuary world. The world beyond the nebula was impossible and beautiful beyond anything Jake had ever imagined in his dreams. It hung in space, surrounded by shattered moons with debris frozen in orbit. Like a protective crown of broken rock, the planet glowed, with light from forests of silver trees and oceans that sparkled and cities that grew from earth. Like crystalline flowers, Etheria Lyra breathed with tears streaming down her face in the last haven, and we thought it was lost when the shadow fleet came, but the cities were lit and ships moved between them, and Jake saw people in those cities, and thousands of them were alive. Elves with pointed ears and glowing skin were living and thriving on this world that everyone thought was destroyed. Long ago, Ruby launched from Lyra's shoulder and grew to full size and spiraled through the air, roaring joy into the sky. Ah! Below them, answering roars echoed back, and more dragons rose to meet Ruby in an aerial dance of reunion and celebration. Landed in the central city on a platform where a huge crowd had gathered to see who had arrived. An old elf with silver hair and warrior braids and ancient battle-scarred armor stood at the front, and when he saw Lyra his eyes went wide. Impossible. He whispered in little Lyra Silverwind, and they told me, you died at the Battle of 7 Stars. Lyra stepped from the ship and called him Commander Kane, and said he was captain of her mother guard. Kane moved forward, and to Jake's surprise the old warrior knelt before Lyra and called her his queen. He said they thought the line of Silverwind had ended, and they were the last survivors of their race. Lyra helped him rise and asked, hiding 30,000 on this world, Kane replied, and perhaps 50,000 more scattered across the galaxy, hiding and surviving. His expression hardened, and he warned that the Shadow Fleet still hunted them, and the Collective served the darkness. They had lost 3 sanctuaries in the last decade to hunter attacks. Then we prepare for war, Lyra said in a voice that rang across the platform and carried to the entire crowd. No more hiding and no more running. And the Starborn Elves were guardians of this galaxy before the Shadow Fleet came. We will be guardians again. She declared. The crowd erupted in cheers that shook the air. But Kane looked troubled and worried about their small numbers, my queen. We are so few, he said, and the Shadow Fleet is vast beyond counting, which is why we need allies, Lyra replied and turned to Jake. Humanity is young but resourceful, she explained, and other races remember the old wars and old alliances. The Shadow Fleet threatens all life in this galaxy, and it is time we made that clear to everyone. Over the following days, Jake watched Lyra transformed from exhausted refugee into a true queen and symbol of hope. Scattered elves sent messages of support, and old allies reached out, remembering ancient pacts with the Starborn. But Jake also saw darkness gathering as the Collective prowled the nebula edge, and something larger was coming. A Shadow Fleet dreadnought, ancient and terrible, was drawn by the sudden activity around Etheria on the eve of battle. Lyra found Jake on a balcony overlooking the silver forests that glowed softly in the night. You do not have to stay, she said quietly, and you have done more than anyone could ask. And this war is not yours, Jake. Looked at this impossible, ancient beautiful creature who had crashed into his life and turned everything upside down when you woke up, he said. You thanked me for giving you time and a chance, and you gave me something to purpose, he continued, and a reason to be more than just a salvager picking through wreckage for scraps. Lyra's fingers intertwined with his, and she felt the familiar tingle of contact between their very different kinds. The battle tomorrow will be terrible, she warned, and the Shadow Fleet shows no mercy to anyone. Then it is good. You have a mechanic who is really good at fixing broken things. Jake smiled. Besides, he added, Ruby would never forgive me if I left now. The dragon landed beside them, magnificent and deadly, and nuzzled both Lyra and Jake, with a rumbling purr, when this is over, Lyra said, and when we have won or lost, and when the war finally ends, stay with me. Help me rebuild what was lost, she continued, and help me create something new from the ashes. Jake pulled her close, and she came willingly, with her head resting on his shoulder as they looked at the stars. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, and somewhere in the dark, the shadow fleet approached. But here now, in this moment, there was light and hope. And a salvager, and a queen, and a dragon bound together tomorrow, they would fight for the future. Tonight they had each other, and somehow, Jake thought, as Lyra's hand tightened in his, that was enough to face whatever darkness was coming.